This is John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and is an Assistant Professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And this is my presentation, Food Fraud Prevention, at the ASTA Annual Meeting 2018, the pre-conference workshop on food fraud. I'll begin. First off, we'll take a moment to review some ASTA resources from the past. So there's several very interesting and in-depth guidances. One of the most recent ones related to food fraud is Identification and Prevention of Adulteration. And next was a little older, Clean, Safe Spices guidance. And then just an overview on the website of different resources for adulteration and food fraud. In these, some key points are that for the first Identification and Prevention of Adulteration guidance, the workshop that led to this focused on where there might be an opportunity for fraudulent practices. And I think this is a key and a point that is aligned with our research, is looking for opportunity and the fraud opportunity. We need to understand incidents themselves, but those incidents, they're important, but more importantly, that they reveal different types of vulnerabilities or gaps in our programs. Which led to another point that I thought was interesting, solutions for addressing these vulnerabilities. And I think that's a real key, vulnerabilities here. Why, let's say food fraud, I'll try to talk through EMA and food fraud as different concepts, but why food fraud occurs. A key step in the prevention of food fraud is to understand why it occurs. This is the fraud opportunity. This is criminology. This is core crime science that really focuses on those supply chain gaps and vulnerabilities. And this is the focus of our Food Fraud Initiative research. So our presentation and your work is definitely very aligned. To look in a little more detail in this report, they have a section, a decision tree to protect spices against supply chain vulnerabilities. And there's a really interesting detailed set of questions there. Question 6 is, are you aware and have assessed vulnerabilities in the supply chain? And the key here, I think, this assessment and vulnerability assessment. And the follow-up question for that is, are you confident that your supplier has? And if no, then see this recommendation. A key here for the spice industry is you're looking at your suppliers, but also down the line, the manufacturers and the retailers, they're holding each other accountable for this as well. So the retailer is going to be asking the manufacturer, do they have they assessed their vulnerabilities? Do they have the supply chain in control? Those manufacturers in turn are going to ask you. A real key is if you do have a robust program of identifying and supporting and presenting your vulnerability assessment and prevention strategies, then those manufacturers are going to have more confidence in you. When they have more confidence in you, then we would think that would lead to more business. A key is that along the supply chain, we all need to understand the basic concepts of how to do a vulnerability assessment and how to put in a prevention strategy that really makes sense, that really does protect the supply chain. At that point, we'll all be safer and we'll all receive more value. Under this section E, on the understanding vulnerability in your supply chain, there were some key points we saw. This requires regular reviews. Completely agree. It's a risk assessment. It's ongoing. When you have new information, you'll conduct new assessments. We don't exactly know now how soon those occur. There's not prescribed triggers to do them. Consider possible vulnerabilities. That's a key, possible vulnerabilities. So just because an incident occurred for someone else, then maybe you don't have the same processes in place. But let's look at how it occurred. And so you'd consider possible vulnerabilities in your supply chain if something else did occur. Take into account the following points, and there's a list. It's very helpful to start with a list to give people a running start. And once you have mapped your supply chain, prioritize your findings. So with this, completely agree, and this has been a core of our research as well, of looking at how to do the vulnerability assessments, how to manage the program, how to map supply chains, and then prioritize your findings. So my presentation here will go into details of the research in that area. Dun dun. I love to start with this slide. So many times we're dealing with, I present to a lot of analytical chemists or other food scientists that are used to combating E. coli. Counterfeiters are different than E. coli. They're human adversaries. They actively seek to avoid detection. So if you publish your guidance documents, why wouldn't a counterfeiter read those? Why wouldn't they use those to understand what you're doing, how you're trying to catch them, how your systems are protected? So we need to understand this and really embrace it, not to fight it. I mean, we're not going to tell people exactly everything that we're doing, but that if we understand they're looking, we might as well take that to our advantage and think that bad guys are actually reading what we do. So hopefully we can lead them to believe and understand that the supply chain is very secure and that they have a high potential to be caught, and so that reduces their fraud opportunity. So this is a real key and something to think about, something we do need to consider in every activity that we do related to food fraud. So just real briefly to tell you about us. So we're academics. We teach. That's the core of what we do. Me coming out here is outreach, interacting with you, even putting the presentation together last night even. Just I was looking at the slides again, and I got some new insight. And working with students and other things, I learn a lot. Once we learn a lot, we find some questions. So we go back and we research them. So that's going back into the literature, even developing new concepts as well. That research then goes into our graduate courses, education, which then comes back out as presentations and outreach. One of our prime education modes right now are MOOCs, massive open online courses. They're free, open, and online. We have a food fraud audit guide we offer twice a year, and the food fraud overview twice a year, and the food fraud audit guide we've been presenting monthly. Because right now there's such a growth and need for this due to the GFSI requirements. Emphasize it's free. The content is always free for all of our MOOCs. We do have a certificate of completion that costs $100, but the content is always free. So you can forward it to your suppliers, your purchasing agents, anybody that your kids, anybody that wants to see it, they can see it. Open access, and that's a real key to get more information out, to get more prevention out there. We just were asked to develop a food defense audit guide because of those new GFSI requirements, and so we're also offering that monthly for support. We do executive education or short courses. These are either at Michigan State or around the country. They could be public events or they could be just for companies. We have graduate courses, and we have 6 of them, and if you take 4 of the courses, then you could get a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. A key to those graduate courses is they're real Michigan State graduate courses, 3 credits. They're hard work, but they really provide a foundation for education. It's not so much training on how to do it, but on the background and basics. So these range of courses have food fraud either directly in it or as a module or part of it. And if you're taking those courses and you like the credits, you can roll them into Masters of Science in Food Safety. And many of the companies here at this conference, you have people that are taking our program now or have taken it in the past. So those credits can work into a Masters of Science in Food Safety. Next, just real briefly to thank we have a food fraud think tank. They fund a lot of our work. They support our mission. They help lead policy and strategy. This provides internal and external leadership for them. That they are involved externally with us, but also internally. They demonstrate their focus and the importance of this area by saying that they are a part of a think tank like this. And so to thank Dannon, Mars, Cargill, Wegmans, Mondelez, Hershey's, and Woolworths from Australia. And I bet that each one of those are a customer of yours somewhere down the supply chain. So the work that we do will be directly important to you. Deliverables that we've done from the think tank are things like being able to go to Codex or ISO. So as global regulations are changing, we're a part of that. The Food Fraud Audit Guide was directly a recommendation from the think tank and supported by them. We expand a lot of online resources, such as this presentation, posting it on YouTube. We do reports and benchmarking surveys. So to look at the primer overviews, to jump into food fraud now. So the first step is to look at what are the basic requirements. I mean, you want to have a real robust and total program, protect everything, but the first step is to pass an audit, get your certification. So we want to get to point B, from point A to point B, before we get all the way to point Z. So let's look at what GFSI says. And your customers are GFSI compliant, and those retailers that buy from those manufacturers require GFSI compliance. So now you're not really compliant to GFSI. It would be FSSC or BRC or IFS or SQF or one of those food safety standards, but they in turn are based on GFSI. So first, to look at this food fraud vulnerability assessment. Again, key ASTA terms. The standard shall require that the organization has a documented food fraud vulnerability assessment. So documented vulnerability assessment, that's the key part of this. Food fraud mitigation plan. The organization has a documented, there it is again, implemented to mitigate those vulnerabilities that you find. This is aligned with the guidance that you've had before as well, so nothing's a surprise here. Then the last part is they separated it out, shall cover the relevant GFSI scope. This is real key because GFSI went further to emphasize that it's this, look at the GFSI scope. So it's not your scope, it's not scope that someone else decided. GFSI looks at all fraud and all products. So that's a real key to look at the GFSI scope. We'll cover that in another slide. A real important point here is that every vulnerability does not need a control plan. So there's a big concern that if we start to identify all these vulnerabilities, that every vulnerability needs a control plan. But no, think about HACCP as well, that every single potential hazard out there doesn't have a control plan. So you do prioritize, but a key is you need to have a way to prioritize it. If you don't have a method, then it's really more of a guess, and it might not hold up under scrutiny later. The analogy we use for thinking about vulnerabilities that do not need a control plan is a meteor. So this building here, we have a vulnerability that we could get hit by a meteor. So that is a vulnerability. Now, it's so improbable. Now, it would be catastrophic if it occurs. The consequence would be very bad. But the likelihood is so small that that's not a hazard that requires a preventive control. Also, with part of this, we consider the risk treatment, what it would cost to control that risk. And so, I mean, to get a building like this, to withstand a direct meteor hit, you'd be a mile underground at least. So that's a real key in the consideration. So you want to find as many vulnerabilities as possible, then assess them and see that they're not hazards that require preventive control. But the key is that you want to identify them because next year, when you go back through the list, maybe some things have changed next year. So that's a real key. You want to be looking for those vulnerabilities. So what is food fraud? Based on GFSI, and remember, to meet the GFSI relevant scope, these are all the types of fraud that GFSI have identified. Some of these are identified in the guidance document itself, in the glossary, and really based on the position paper that's an official GFSI board published document. So what you'll notice is in this region, including overruns and tampering. Those weren't in there, but they're really a part of some of these manufacturing and theft diversion areas. Overruns would be where you order 1,000 cans and someone makes 10,000 and sells those other ones. You don't have control of those, or you don't have control or understanding of the manufacturing process. And tampering could be date code tampering. In this region in the orange is really the traditional FDA economically motivated adulteration. And that's a real key. When you talk about EMA, then if you're dealing with FDA, you need to use FDA's definition. That's really the bottom line. FDA defines it as a substance for economic gain, only a substance in there. But a key is GFSI, and all fraud could lead to a problem for you. So you do need to look at the wide range of food fraud. And this broad scope is really consistent with the UK, the EU, China, ISO, GFSI, and really think about FDA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So you could be compliant. I mean, it might be misbranded products. So under Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there's an adulterated food section and a separate misbranded food section. So even if the labeling's off, if it's perfectly safe, manufactured, been in your control, but it has the wrong country of origin on it, that's mislabeled, it's unfit for commerce and really illegal product. So that's a key. When you're looking at prevention, it's most efficient to look at all types of fraud at one time. So a key with the food risk matrix is just showing how food fraud is different than the other types of food risks. Food safety and food defense, we know. We've been dealing with those for a long time. When we started to look at food fraud and specifically prevention, we found that food fraud was fundamentally different. So we'll look into that and explain exactly why. Now, food quality is also on this chart because usually these are quality management systems in general. Identify a hazard, manage a hazard, look at root causes. And also most of the food safety, food defense, food fraud groups are under a quality group in a company. A company has quality losses every minute of every day. So these are all food risks, not necessarily food hazards, say health hazards, but financial risks. The column on the left is unintentional. You don't try to create those acts. The column on the right is intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing. For food defense, the intent is harm. You're trying to hurt somebody else. Now, it could be economically hurt someone else, but the key is you're harming other people. That's the motivation. You want people to be harmed and know they've been harmed in most cases. For food fraud, the motivation is economic gain for themselves. And one of the keys we say with food fraud is that the bad guys are actively seeking to avoid detection. They're going to understand and study our test methods, our processes, and they're going to try to find ways around them. Terrorism has been talked about a lot more in Europe, especially right now, looking at food terrorism. Terrorism is a very important subset, but a subset. And FDA looks at the intentional adulteration rule, which is only wide-scale harm. So a disgruntled employee under the FSMA-IA rule would not be covered. Now, it would still be illegal under other. It would still be a hazard, but specifically for the intentional adulteration rule, it would not be in there. A key is with GFSI, looking at the food defense requirements, they require protecting from all types of fraud. GFSI requires all these things to be under control. Economically motivated adulteration is a subset of food fraud because it's just a substance. Remember all those types of fraud? So that's a real key that it fits in there. So we'll look at different ways to really have a prevention strategy implementation through a series of activities. And this is an academic article, a scholarly article that we published a while ago, actually with the head of food fraud from Ireland, the country. And we went through and really looked at a methodical way to develop a full food fraud prevention strategy. Now, most of you have a lot of this in place, but maybe this is just a methodical way to look at it and see if there's any gaps or any refinement. First off, if you don't have one at all, convene a food fraud task force. If you do have a food fraud plan in place, then a recommendation would be to form a task force to look at it again. And the first step, or the second step there, is to create an enterprise-wide food fraud policy or mission statement and begin drafting the food fraud prevention plan. So we want to have some type of overall mission. Look at your food safety mission, your food quality mission, whatever it is, adjust from there, but to say, what are you really doing with the food fraud piece here? A key is draft it. You don't need to get full formal approval of it yet, but you want to just get started as a scope. A key is if you're only looking at the intentional adulteration rule, then that's food defense. So that's a real key. If you're looking at GFSI, then you've got a specific scope. Conduct a pre-filter food fraud initial screening. This is a very quick pass. This is based on managerial accounting practices of COSO, the Enterprise Risk Management System. We didn't make this up. COSO has a two-stage process: an initial screen and a detailed assessment. So do the light one first. You're looking very broad at the top level to see where you need to go deeper, and then review additional needs, including additional information for more detailed food fraud vulnerability assessment, where you need to go deeper. Only go deeper where you need to go deeper. Review the specific food fraud vulnerabilities in an enterprise-wide risk map. So once you have an assessment, as it said in your industry guidances, is that you need to have some way to prioritize these risks. Not every vulnerability is a risk that needs to be managed, and so you need to have some way to prioritize them and to identify which ones need to be addressed. Consider countermeasures and control systems there for especially the bad ones. It's good to run through, when you have any theory, it's good to run through with real case studies, real examples to show how it works. And then propose the food fraud prevention strategy, including the calibration of the food fraud risks on the enterprise risk map. So what you want to do is you want to finish this project of either the review of your current program or your first program, and have a moment there where it kind of closes, you have the final presentation, and then you get approval and buy-in on moving forward. It's a really important point to not just kind of keep going forward. There needs to be a point where someone says, here's what we need to do. We've seen a lot of people that started through this one time and never really got the approvals. They never really formed a food fraud team. So years later, they really haven't started. They did their first pass, but they didn't start a real program. We'll first look at this, the part about the policy and strategy. We have another article on food fraud prevention, policy, strategy, and decision making. Hey, how about that for a title? We looked at the very first steps. And the first one is the concept one, formally and specifically mentioned food fraud as a food issue. This is a food industry issue. It's a food safety issue. It's a food issue. It's not corporate security. It's not supply chain. It's not your customers. It's not your suppliers. It's your food issue. And that's a real key to really take ownership. You think about food safety culture. That's something right now that people are really taking accountability for. And this is along that concept. Concept two is create an enterprise-wide food fraud prevention plan. So there needs to be this overall kind of mission that you're going to have a plan. Now, these don't have to be really complex once you get them implemented, but the key is to have a separate plan so that you have a real focus. So to look at this initial screening and this pre-filter piece, we've actually done a lot of work in this area because it's been very frustrating for people, and us included, to do these assessments. And so we really felt like we needed to find more rigor. We need to look into the risk sciences, decision sciences, managerial accounting, food science, and really dig in to see where there was more of a methodical approach. And so that's what we found with this food fraud initial screening concept. So the vulnerability assessments, there's a hierarchy of assessments here. This is the first thing to really look at. You've got, we'll really start here with the corporate risk appetite. So your company has a certain level of risk. If you're in the food industry, you have a certain appetite for risk. And then that's managed by enterprise risk management here at the top. And under there, there's this continuum between the pre-filter in the green and a detailed vulnerability assessment in the red. And the pre-filters, like this initial screen that we have, and then the S-Safe organization and others have different types of vulnerability assessments for all products. Within that, you might identify some specific products, such as ingredients, food ingredients, that require more detailed assessment. People like USP have their mitigation guide that's for ingredients, food ingredients. All these come together and you plot them on a corporate risk map, and that feeds back into the corporate risk appetite. So that's the hierarchy of these assessments. The food fraud initial screening tool, this was actually published by us in Food Control. And really broadly, we'll look at just food fraud in general from a very high level standpoint, looking at the assessment based on enterprise risk management. A key is this is how public companies are in the U.S. are required to manage their businesses. So that's just a legal requirement from Sarbanes-Oxley in the U.S. And so we wanted to correlate this with other food fraud and food safety management systems as well. What we do first is we look at a simple matrix for incoming goods and outgoing goods. It's very different buying from India and selling to India. We look at product groups at the start. So we can take it very simple at the start. Now this is the getting to plan B, or point B, not point Z yet. We're just starting. It's very high level. What we want to do is we want to identify the areas where you need more research. Because with some companies, if they buy from so say one of your great spice companies that's a trusted strategic supplier for a manufacturer, if you have these controls in place, then one thing we tell people is that, hey, look, if you buy from one of those strategic partners, if they let you pay the invoice, then your fraud opportunity is very low. Because high quality companies will go pull back their product. They'll chase down every pallet if there's a problem with it. So we look broadly at groups at first. Sometimes with those quality suppliers, you can, people have been able to identify 90% of their products as very low risk right at the start. We look at suppliers and countries. So customers, it's either by countries, depending on how you buy, or types of products or companies that you buy from. And here's what a matrix looks like for this. So for the incoming goods, we've got the markets and regions, and we've got the groups right there, and I put spices right up there. So at the very beginning, from someone, it might be very high. At this point, then, you would identify one cell. So say this was the only cell that was very high, then that's the first one you'd look at. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how you get to that point, but that's what's important. Is if you showed this chart, there would be a lot of debate and fighting and arguing and debating and discussing. That's great, because we're getting very much to a detail of, well, how do we judge what's a very high or very low? So from a group think standpoint, this is really important to get people moving. And then once we do conduct these assessments for incoming goods and outgoing goods, we plot them on a corporate risk map. Now, we might not know, as a food safety team, we might not know exactly what's out there or what this looks like, but we're taking our shot at it. Generally what gets people really worried in your company. When do they spend resources? When do they recall a product? And so what we do here is, for this was an actual company, we tried to plot what we thought were these issues. So you see here in the orange, there's 4 in the orange. Those are the 4 that we'd look at. The yellow is kind of, those are ones that would be discussed, but that's kind of actively monitor area, worrisome. But so this company's not in too bad a shape, but they've got 4 right there. So this is real easy to look at one chart to all of a sudden synthesize everything down to know exactly what you're talking about. what we have here is that we just, for convenience, we split these up into incoming goods are numbered and outgoing goods are lettered. Because all of a sudden, look over there. So 2 of them are incoming goods and 2 of them are outgoing goods for a concern. So that just helps to look at the risks themselves. At this point, we then ask, does the resource allocation decision maker need more information for whatever question we're asking? You might not. I mean, all of a sudden, if item number 2 is buying product Michigan cherries from Spink, and you say, we don't trust Spink at all, then if you stop buying from Spink, then number 2 would be gone. You would eliminate that vulnerability of your concern of buying from Michigan cherries from me. And so the decision maker might not need, you don't need to go do any more research if the decision maker says, yeah, stop buying from them. So that's a real key that we want to look at. That's why we want to get to this corporate risk map right away. Now, there's a lot of times where we have to go into a lot more detail, and there may be a lot of discussion about all 4 of these or every one that's on here. That's great, because the resource allocation decision maker is then telling you how deep you need to go. And to look at how deep you need to go, here's an example of to address specific problems in assessing and evaluating those risk treatments. So say that first chart that we looked at for incoming goods. We're looking at that cell B2. So that's the one, there's 2 there that are in the red, but we'll look at the 1. So that's the one that we're really worried about. So at this point, we don't have enough information to get that to be down in the green zone anymore, so or yet. So what we do is for that cell, we drill deeper. So we do a 5x5 matrix of the detail of B2. All of a sudden, look, when we dug into that, it was red there. All of a sudden, whoa, it's not really red. There's only one cell that's orange. So it's really not all that entire category. It's this one item. Well, let's dig into that. Blow it up, a 5x5 of that one. Wow, okay. Now we've identified from all the detail in that one cell, there's only one cell down here. Now I'm being simplistic, of course, for example, but there's only one cell that led to this being orange, that this led to this being red. We got one cell. At this point, we drilled down to where a one risk treatment can change the assessment of that cell. So we stopped buying Michigan cherries from Spink. If we did that, all of a sudden that cell goes from red to green. We made one risk treatment. So we update the detail back on that slide. We go back up one level here, update that. Oh, that one's green now too. Now we then update back upwards. All of a sudden, that original cell, we've got enough detail that one treatment can change the rank. And that one cell went from red now to green, which is in the acceptable zone. So this is why it's really important to start at the very high level, broad, and then dig in only where you need to dig in. Dig in until you've got where risk treatment can change that output, and then you can move back up as well. And the key is we've got training on this. We've got these published and things. So here's a real simple process for you. So then the last piece is this review specific food fraud vulnerabilities in an enterprise risk map and looking at enterprise risk management. So what we want to do is we want to look at all risks or vulnerabilities within this map. Now, if you're a food safety person, if I gave you a lab result that said your product had salmonella in it in the marketplace right now, you would excuse yourself from this meeting and go make a phone call. Now, you don't want to make that phone call. No one wants to get your phone call, but you know you need to make that phone call. If you waited till the end of the day or till tomorrow, you might not have a job tomorrow night because this is so bad. If there's product in the marketplace, you want to move quickly on it. A key here is there's the information that you know, information that you trust, and a process that you know you need to handle. With enterprise risk management, that's the same thing. Well, the CEO or chief risk officer wouldn't have to deal with it by the end of today or maybe by the end of tomorrow, but pretty darn soon. They see that in the A1. If they have not disclosed that risk on their legal Sarbanes-Oxley 10Q or 10K forms, then that's illegal. So this is what we're showing them, something that's equivalent to that lab report with salmonella. That's why this is so important, because it calibrates with their decision making, and we can start to figure out where we are. Now, if a new incident occurs, so say there was the peanut and cumin. For your company, if you ran an assessment, you could say, well, that's bad. Yes, it's bad. But where is it on the chart? If you have certain processes in place, then maybe your vulnerability assessment shows that peanut and cumin is D5 all of a sudden, how's D5 looking? It's in the blue. It's in the blue zone. You're still okay. Now, the risk might have increased from D2 to D5, so it might have increased, but it's still within your risk tolerance. If it did pop up into the yellow zone, orange or red, then you would now have an assessment that you would know that you really need to be taking some action. But that's the key, is once you have any incident, we really can't judge if it, I mean, that's bad, but where and how bad, and how is it bad in relation to the risk tolerance. That's why enterprise risk and these corporate risk maps are so important for applying it. And the board and the C-suite cannot allow red because they need to disclose it. So finally, looking at the food fraud prevention strategy, this whole calibration on an enterprise risk map. We've got this prevention, look for accountability, really document the process, utilize the food fraud prevention cycle. So this is something we've got here to look at accountability and responsibility. It's all about the fraud opportunity here. That's the core. We've got income, and then with the process, we've got a review of incidents, things coming in, horizon scanning, public policy. This is all information that's coming in to be assessed. Then you've got this initial screening that we talked about, and a key point here is connecting with enterprise risk management. This is the calibration with enterprise-wide risks. Then you conduct a rank, you look at countermeasures, and that changes the fraud opportunity. And then you would go back and you would do a vulnerability assessment again, a more detailed one, and you then also again look at enterprise risk management. And that's why we've got now a cycle. So this is the cycle, the food fraud prevention cycle that's within the food fraud strategy. Assign accountability and responsibility for key actions. It's got to be clear in your organization when a problem comes in, how it gets assigned, and that people deal with it until it's assessed and judged to be within control or disclosed farther above. At least an annual vulnerability assessment. It's set by your needs. At least an annual review of best practices. Things are going to be changing an awful lot in food fraud over time here. And just do it. Just start. That's a real key. Takeaways to focus on: prevent all food fraud, not just adulterant substances. When you start this process, it's really just easiest to look at all of it at once. Now, you may decide at this moment that you're not going to look at smuggled goods or something else, but you've identified that within your food fraud team. You've identified that as something you are not doing. It's not just something that didn't get done. Look at all compliance. So again, the preventive controls rule is one thing, GFSI is one thing, but there's a whole lot of different laws out there. And if you align with these type of practices, then you will be aligned with things like the securities laws, Sarbanes-Oxley. Reduce your recall potential. That's the overall. That's your job. So you might say, well, I'm only FSMA, I'm only this or that, or that's not my job, it's someone else's. Well, bottom line is you're here, you're learning about food fraud, you have a visibility about a enterprise-wide risk of your company, and you're accountable for that. Reduce liability in general. That's for your company overall. We have a lot of ways you can get involved with us, so please feel free to contact us. Graduate courses, executive education, MOOCs, multi-client studies. A lot of people to thank. I'm really, really thankful. Hopefully we'll do a lot more together moving forward. I think there's a lot of great opportunities for us. With that, we'll take questions.